Alright, I need people to listen to me. I need to assert to all of you that this is the exact same person. So, in the new Fallout, there is this ghoul character, right? This sexy ghoul character who is a cowboy dressed in all black, and the way they act, the way that they present themselves is they inflict violence, incredibly graphic violence on their enemies in order to inflict their worldview onto the impressionable, naive main girl lead in the show. And it took me maybe 2 weeks of synthesis after watching the series to realize, oh wait, this is Westworld. Okay? No, don't leave yet. I've got you. Stay here. Stay with me. Imagine this, okay? Let me just re-describe what I just said. There's a character who is a ghoul. No, I actually love the way he looks. I love William. There's a character who is a cowboy dressed in all black who often leads with hyper-violent means to entertain and push their narrative, their perspective on the world, on its impressionable female lead. Both of which, both the one in Fallout and the one in Westworld, are resistant to seeing the world this way. This is Westworld 1, by the way, Westworld Season 1. I know it changes afterward, and my hypothesis sort of breaks down, but that's the thing about literary criticism, that you only need to cover you only need to cover what fits within your argument for it to sound cohesive. So, both these characters, men in black, hyper-violent in order to push their perspective of the world on the naive lead, right? Not only that, but both of these characters started their life of spoilers for everything. Pardon me. I should have led with spoilers for Westworld and Fallout. Both of these characters start out as young, idealistic businessmen at the head of their prime, at the head of their trajectory as a figure in the public zeitgeist, who are entering a venture with spooky, not forthcoming businessmen who are intending to sell a product that could lead to the end of the world. And I think it's interesting that we've fallen twice now into that trend, into that idea. It's kind of the reverse of the dad-ification of video games. You might have heard that term floating around in literary circles and video essay circles, wherein a lot of games from like 2005 through 2015 were games about embodying a strong male lead who teaches the often surrogate for life after a turbulent time, a young woman, how to survive in that space, right? I think this is interesting because it is like the abusive stepfather-ification of television, where within the trope of dad-ification of games, parents and fathers are not only permitted, but they're also encouraged to perform hyperviolence for the sake of protecting a future, for protecting this kind of idealized sense of humanity and self. Where the inverse of that in Fallout and Westworld is that here is this guy who, through hyperviolence, attempts to also teach this person lessons about the world that they're in, and ends up being rebuffed and challenged by that younger person. And I think both of them inherently have different relationships with violence because of the mediums that they are inhabiting. The reason that you have to kind of lean into violence being chill, being okay, being a legitimate means for basically any problem to progress the plot is because the player is the enactor of violence. There's no gameplay in Last of Us unless you are going out of your way to protect this girl by any means possible, which includes stealth killing every single individual in a small settlement. Telltale's Walking Dead isn't exactly the same because it's more like a making choices simulator, but Lee has been shown, depending on the playthrough, to use violence as a means to get to an end. And this is also not an indictment of violence. Violence, and even hyperviolence, depending on very specific circumstances, can be useful and necessary in order to advance any kind of movement, any kind of group. But that is not the point. I think the relationship that film can have with violence is fundamentally different than that from video games. Because in film, because we're not the ones enacting the violence, the whether that violence is power fantasy, whether that violence is something that we should aspire to, something that is cool for us. And I guess, I'm not gonna lie, watching the ghoul fight, watching the Man in Black fight in both of those series was kind of aspirational. It was pretty cool, wasn't it? But the framing it as though it is something to aspire to versus something that is to be feared is something that the director has much more control over. The director can direct the camera much tighter in order to describe how we should feel about something, versus in games where implicitly the person doing all the things has to be the good guy. Far Cry 3 is the exception that proves the rule. Generally, we want to root for the hero, even if they're a really messed up bad guy, and we excuse their violence in that way. Relationship to violence between games and movies aside, what I think is interesting about like the reverse dad-ification of games, or the I'm trying to think of another word, disciplinarian-ification of shows, I think that the through line that we're meant to feel somewhat is that there is a naivety or a hope in these men in black that is lost at some point. A hope that is seen in this young female protag. It's almost always that. It's meant to emulate the relationship between father and child somewhat. No, there's this kind of like guiding through line for that. But the Man in Black in both of these series internalizes the abuse that has gone to them, the trauma that they've taken, and looking at that trauma creates a thesis for how the world works, and sees himself as doing a favor to this younger person by extending this lesson, and through extending this lesson is saving her from learning the hard way, the way the Man in Black has. The Man in Black is communicating his trauma to the protagonist in order to, in their own mind, save them. Well, we have to remember that we're also looking at film from the perspective of this younger protagonist, and how do they see the world? And if they see the world explicitly, sort of contrastingly, hopefully, the Man in Black does not become a teacher, does not become a father, does not become a proper guide for this newbie. They become simply a perpetrator of violence, trying to communicate their trauma onto her. And it is our job as viewers to cheer for and sort of emotionally support this person and their hope, their innocence, because that is ultimately, that goal, that light is the thing that's worth protecting. It's not something to grow out of. It is something that is inherently precious, and this idealism in a sea of cynicism, often in Wasteland or in Far-Reached Frontier, in both cases, there is a seed of good that needs to be protected. Ding ding, 10 minutes.